And this interconnection between the search for new life on Titan, the forging of a new form of life on Mars, and the impact of both of these things on the old forms of life on Earth really is, I think, the central theme of this season, and it's brought into a particularly sharp focus in this episode, which I thought was good and effective. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson, and I'm a political scientist who has just watched episode 8 of season 5 of For All Mankind. The episode is called Brave New World, and I'm going to give my instant reactions to the themes of this episode with, of course, a heavy focus on its political ideas. I'm on my own this week. Professor Dudas is away, and so I would really appreciate your support in the comments. Please help me to understand this episode, check what I say, have I got it right, do you have alternate views on what this episode means, and where this season is going. And I do want to take some time towards the end of this video to talk about how I see this episode fitting in the broader arc of the season, and what I think this season is really about. I also, again, towards the end of the video, want to respond to some of the comments that were left on last week's video. So in Brave New World, we see that the new really is being discovered, is being searched for in 3 different places. Of course, you've got the ongoing story of the Martian Revolution and the attempt to forge a new kind of social and political settlement for the people on Mars. You've got the literal search for new life, which is happening on Titan as Kelly continues to kind of completely take over that mission. And then you've got the impact of, in particular, the Martian developments on the old forms of politics and society back on Earth, as some very old political structures look to be crumbling and some new deals are about to be forged. And this interconnection between the search for new life on Titan, the forging of a new form of life on Mars, and the impact of both of these things on the old forms of life on Earth really is, I think, the central theme of this season, and it's brought into a particularly sharp focus in this episode, which I thought was good and effective. Let's begin with what I think is the core of this episode, which are the developments on Happy Valley, really the capital of the new Martian Revolution. And I do think in this episode, all elements of the Martian Revolution, the brave new Martian society, are coming into focus, are being institutionalized, and are being strengthened. The Mars Council is really working effectively at this point, and they have some strong advantages. They've got a source of privileged information in the form of Irina, who continues to bring important intelligence and developments to the attention of the Martian Council. And they also, I think, this week have a much more effective leadership structure and leader in Miles, who seems to have suddenly sort of found his groove in becoming an effective leader. He's evincing at this point a much more decisive nature and a much broader strategic vision than he's had in the past. And this is an episode in which Miles, I think, comes into his own, and he combines his practical skills, his knowledge of chemistry and engineering, along with a sort of newfound strategic vision and confidence as a leader in really driving things forward, in integrating the different forms of information that he has and taking decisive action, which of course is the central function of a leader of any political structure. Of course, the new is coming to strangle the old in the cradle in the form of a military expedition from Earth. I do think it was quite a funny moment when Miles is, presented with this news and he says, "That's not true, we would have seen it coming a long way off." And I think as viewers, we think the same thing. I'm not sure we ever actually did see the military expedition en route, although of course it was obvious from Avery Stevens' training and storyline on Earth that was where things were going. Just a sidebar, I did think it was very interesting to see the troop transport that was bringing Avery Stevens and the Marines to launch their invasion of Mars. It shows another type of space vessel that Earth has developed. I did think I was put in mind of the Sulaco, the troop transport from Aliens, or maybe some of the Earth cruisers from Babylon 5 by its design. Very interesting of the show's creators to continue to show us how space travel, and in this case, force projection over space, has become institutionalized and routinized in the Earth of this alternate timeline, with a differentiation of the capabilities of projection of human power across the solar system. The manner of resistance of this invasion, which is suggested to Miles by the North Korean astronaut, is to blow up the port, essentially, to blow up the spaceport, or at least the platform of the spaceport on Kuznetsov Station, and Miles takes decisive action and signals that is in fact what should be done. And this is a fairly classic military strategy in resisting invasion by a superior military force. You may, if you'd followed the news recently, have seen the reports that Denmark had landed troops in Greenland, and they were prepared to blow up the major runways in Greenland when that territory was considered under threat by President Trump in recent months. Institutionally, a Martian state is also starting to take shape. Celia is training, or is inducting, the Happy Valley Corps, a new sort of peacekeeping or police force buy-in of the people of Mars, so having a very different kind of posture than the previous Martian peacekeeping force. And she gives a speech in which she talks about a new Martian identity being forged. Wherever you were from, you're now from Mars. This is going to be a peacekeeping force that does things differently. Earlier in the season, she talked about being of a lineage of peacekeeping forces, of police forces, and wanting to do something different, and thinking that coming to Mars, she could break the patterns of her own family past. And she now sort of completes that journey by saying a month ago, I couldn't have told you what a Marsi was, but now I'm proud to say that I am one, and that we're going to be a different kind of force. Of course, the exertion of control over the means of force, a monopolization of the legitimate use of force, is if not the key feature of a political state. And here we do see the Martian Revolution again institutionalizing itself. Even more importantly, I would say, the new Martian state new Martian society is starting to produce its own culture, its own art, its own way of thinking through who it is, how it wants to present itself to the world, what stories it's going to tell to itself and about itself. And this, again, is an absolutely central aspect of forging a nation state, which is clearly what the Martian Revolution is becoming. We see, I think, actually quite a good short film produced by Gulsara before her death, a bleak documentary, a black and white documentary with some fairly florid lines of prose, including living under a tuberculous sky, which of course is a line that she had borrowed from an Allen Ginsberg Beat Generation poem. And we do see the new generation on Mars being a sort of beat generation. In a sense, they are the future, and the show's presenting them to us as the future. But For All Mankind is also an explicitly nostalgic show. It does exist in this strange sort of liminal space. It's retelling a contemporary story. It's presenting futuristic human capabilities and where it perhaps hopes that our human society could go. But it does so largely through the lens of nostalgia. The motivating impulse of the show is a nostalgia for the exploratory and daring imagery of the space race. And really here you see, in reaching back to the past, Allen Ginsberg in the kind of protest song in C major, which had, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen vibes that we see presented halfway through the show. This is a show whose culture of the future is in some way nostalgic or backward looking to what the show's creators would see as ideologically the best parts of our past. The Beat Generation, it's had in the past a veneration of John Lennon and a sort of peacenik movement. These are, I think, the cultural touchstones that the show is presenting to us as the best aspects of our nature. Lily, I think, has it right when she describes this cultural production not as a PR exercise, although of course that's its explicit form. It will help them to win converts and win support back on Earth. But when she talks about we need to capture what it feels like to live here, not just as a material matter, what is it like, but what does it feels like? What's the texture of life here? And that's done through the protest song, through Gulsey's documentary. That's what societies do through their art. They're not literal documentaries of the practical conditions, although of course that's what happens, but they're really attempts to capture the feeling of living in and belonging to a place. And finally, in terms of developments on Happy Valley, we see how closely these developments are being followed on Earth, and really how these developments on Mars are reshaping or are going to reshape the politics of Earth. It seems fairly clear from Irina Morozova's intelligence report that the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse, that it's really suffering the most as a political and economic system from the cutoff of the iridium shipments, that President Korshenko is sort of one swift boot in the arse away from being deposed from office. This, of course, gets Polivanov's political antenna quivering and fires ambition in him. Polivanov, I think, sees his hero moment hovering into view, and he volunteers along with Celia to take part in the Hopper mission to go and rig with explosives the platform on Kuznetsov station. I think he realizes that this will put him in a heroic position, that it will play well perhaps with reformist elements in the Soviet Union. He either spies himself as the next president of the Soviet Union, that would make a lot of sense, or perhaps he's going to end up being the first president of the Martian Republic. But either way, he's going to be a pivotal figure in negotiating a new settlement with the Soviet Union. As Irina says, as soon as Korshenko's gone, the logical move for Korshenko's successor will be to cut an independent deal with the Martian colony for the reacquisition of iridium shipments. This is going to give Mars really a huge sort of form of leverage over the M6, which Irina says will eventually dissolve. And I think this is sort of the path for independence, the path to independence for Mars. And it is a really sort of interesting development. And you do start to wonder whether it's not the United States, but the Soviet Union that's going to be the vector through which the Martian Revolution transforms Earth politics for the better. It does seem as if we might be heading towards a red Mars in both senses, the kind of normal sense, that's the hue of the planet, the customary sense, but also a communist Mars, or a Mars associated with a reformed Soviet Union. And there would be a nice symmetry there, because Red Moon was, of course, the first episode of For All Mankind, and the Soviet landing on the moon instead of the United States, or ahead of the United States, is the motivating change in the timeline. So it would be a nice piece of symmetry, and I think a good piece of writing, if it's this Soviet-Martian alliance that ends up changing the political balance of power on Earth. On Titan, of course, we perhaps spend less time, but we do spend significant time. The Sojourner has landed away from where it was supposed to do, so now they're sort of out of striking range of the crater where they believe that life may exist. And so Kelly is trying to organize an expedition out to complete the original mission that they'd landed on Mars for. Walt, the nominal captain, is, of course, undergoing a crisis of confidence. He is understandably somewhat confused over how he's managed to find his ship in this position over what's gone wrong. Of course, Kelly could solve his crisis of confidence by explaining pretty directly what happened, which is she shifted the programming around, but she chooses not to do this, instead being sort of outwardly supportive to Walt, but really effectively taking control over the mission in order to fulfill its original objectives. And just a final word about this week's episode specifically, before I give some thoughts on where I think we stand with the season as a whole. I do think this episode looked really, really good, and there has been some debate both on this channel and elsewhere about the aesthetics of the show, particularly early in the season. There was a question mark about various aspects of it. I do think they've hit their stride this season, or at least in this episode. It looked really, really good. I thought the scenes of the hopper emerging from the Martian atmosphere were very, very effective. I was really pleased to spend some time on Kuznetsov Station, which I thought looked just fantastic. The aesthetic of the marine transport ship I thought was really interesting and important, and added another dimension to the visual vocabulary of the show. I do think over the past few seasons they've been really influenced by Chris Nolan's movie Interstellar, both in the use of music and also the use of visuals, and that was very effective in this episode. So big thumbs up, I think, from me in terms of this episode, in terms of the look of the show. Okay, so some overall thoughts on where we stand this season, putting this episode into context. What do I see as the strengths and weaknesses of this season? I continue to be very high on this show. I think it's doing something unique for someone who is interested in the conjunction of politics and popular culture. I think it's an extremely brave show, and as I said, a somewhat singular show. This attempt to tell a comprehensive and cohesive story of the intermingling of politics, of history, of economics, and of society, to essentially do a counter-history or a retelling of our own age as if we had believed our own ideals at the founding of the space race, as if we lived in a more techno-optimistic world. This, I think, is really valuable, and there's something that's really important that's going on here. And I do think that continues to be the show's core strength. I really am in radical appreciation of this attempt to do things you often don't see on television, and to really commit to a cohesive fabric of a counter history as a real signal to us as to how things can be different, how politics can make a difference in the trajectory, the macro trajectory of essentially our species. We're on the cusp of discovering new life in this show. We're seeing new political forms emerge. It's also been done in a way that's, I don't know if realistic is quite the right word, but a plausible and I think good faith way. There's a real theory of historical causation going on in this show. There's a real attempt to give a panoramic view of how the different factors that might shape history in any one era come together, real explorations of cause and effect. Bravo. I think that continues to be really the wonderful and singular quality of this show, and I remain fully on board for this journey. I'm really excited to see where it goes, both in this season and in the next season. That is, though, a mode of narrative address that it is not without cost, and there's a reason why, for example, you often don't see natural resource economics or slow burn geopolitical type strategies playing out on screen. They often don't dramatize particularly well. And one problem that I think For All Mankind has had this season is that it really does sort of telegraph its developments. I think it's been pretty clear from the first episode that there was going to be a Martian revolution, that it was going to influence Earth politics, that it was probably going to do so through the vector of the Soviet Union. And I've taken great pleasure in seeing these things play out, and they haven't all played out exactly as I thought they would. But I do think the broad contours of this season have been clear from the start. Again, I think that is not a fault of writing. I think it's inherent in this mode of address, this panoramic, cohesive view of a society in transition. That's not a mode of address in which you're going to be dropping a lot of cliffhangers or massive sort of plot twists. I don't think, little green men are going to turn out to live on Titan. It's really not that type of show. But I do understand why for some people the show is at least a little predictable in terms of where the storylines are going. For example, I would imagine that we're going to see Alex's pacifism, which he expressed on a number of occasions in this episode, coincide with Avery's doubts about her identity, about her past, and about her role in the Old Earth military mission, and they're going to have a conversation about whether it's really appropriate to use force, and Avery is going to sort of reunite the Stevens and Baldwin families. I thought the show was pretty explicitly telling us that in this episode. Similarly, I think the actual discovery of life on Titan is really about the specific form of that life, and there's a relatively constrained scope of possibilities as to what that life's going to look like. Again, I don't think it's going to be particularly complex or spectacular life. The real question is, what is the discovery of that life? How is it going to play into the political and perhaps even economic structures and stories that are going to be told over the next decade of human history in the show, which of course will be the next season? In one sense, that just does rob the discovery of new life of its dramatic impact. The show essentially told us there was life on Titan and needed to for cohesive narrative reasons in order to motivate everyone to spend all the resources to go out and investigate it. But in another type of show, that discovery of life would be the kind of massive climactic moment and a huge surprise. And again, that's not what For All Mankind is. But overall, a very effective episode, one that I think is bringing the Season 5 arc in, I think, pretty nicely for a landing, and I continue to appreciate all of the many strengths and unique qualities that this show has. Okay, so I'd like in the final part of the video to address viewer comments from last week. We got some really interesting ones. They definitely helped me understand what was going on in that episode, and I clearly missed pretty crucial and important things. Please do leave a comment. We try to respond to every comment below the line. We do really value them. I mean, the big point for us of doing these videos is to have a conversation and to try to think through the text of For All Mankind, not only individually, but in conversation with others and get a deeper understanding in that way. Drew Swenson writes, very engaging discussion. Thank you, Drew. For context, I was Alex's age in 2012, graduation and all, the dancing was the frankly awkward trend of flash mobs. This refers to a comment that we'd made last week in relation to Lily's birthday present for Alex, in which there'd been kind of nudges and winks as to what was going to happen in this late night rendezvous, and it turned out Alex was ambushed by all his buddies coming out of the cornfields and doing an impromptu dance. And I did sort of speculate as to how plausible that was. Was that really what teenagers did? And Drew is reminding me something that I'd forgotten, which was there was a phase of flash mobs of impromptu dancing, which would then be captured on the internet. I'd totally forgotten about that, and it's bravo to the show for aligning the time periods there and for providing a much more plausible view of young adult life than I'd realized that they had. Ryder Lynch writes, it's too early to say whether the revolution will succeed or fail, but I do agree that currently it doesn't have a clear leader. The SDM council scene depicts an organization led more by a disorganized committee than by a defined leader, with Miles being the out of his depth peacemaker between the different factions. As I said earlier in the video, I agree with that last week, and I do think, again, compliments to the show. They've shown a plausible development of Miles as a political leader and the SDM Council as a functioning political organization. Miles has got real this week. They only have a couple of weeks of food left. They're under threat of the use of force. A lot of the problems are not hypothetical or not far in the future, but are immediate and require decisive action. And he's taking decisive action. Again, he's integrating different perspectives. They've got a functioning intelligence organization, if you like, in the form of arena. They've developed a kind of state use of force, or at least peacekeeping arm, in the form of the Happy Valley Corps. They're developing their own native culture. It really is a state that's coming together, and Miles pulling himself together, I think, exemplifies that. Here now is Philip Leavenworth, who's given us a number of hostages to fortune, made a number of predictions about where the season and maybe the series as a whole is going. Let's see how wrong I am, he says. I think the Soviet Union collapses and Polivanov comes in as a hero once the Martian Revolution succeeds. That is looking more likely, Philip, after this week's episode than it was last week's episode. So congrats there. I think you're on the right track. Dev creates the conditions for a paradise on Mars but doesn't live there and relocates to Titan to be away from everyone else. Dev was absent from this week's episode, so we don't know what he is doing. We have no greater clarity on that. I suspect he's going to be a big part of the next week's episode. I do like that idea, though, that Dev is going to create a conditions for a much better Mars, and that's going to be the conclusion of his narrative arc. I do continue to think that it wouldn't quite be in accordance with the show's ideology for him to be a pure evil tech titan. I like also the idea of him going off to live on Titan. I think that puts him in alignment with someone like Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen, who of course would periodically take himself off to, was it the moon Dr. Manhattan would teleport himself to, just because he couldn't stand all of humanity blathering in his ear constantly, and that would kind of reinforce maybe Dev's self-image as this Dr. Manhattan-esque kind of superhuman force. So I like that prediction, Philip. A leader splits Helios in two, with those loyal to Dev and others loyal to a leader. Also, they name a lake after Ed on Titan. I think all of that is entirely plausible. Was really interesting thinking about Helios and the way in which corporations are working in this world, that Kelly's mission to Titan, she explicitly says, is, a Helios mission. It's not a mission of different nations. And if the Mars Revolutionary Council is one form of post-Earth nation-state organization, then the grand corporation like Helios is another form of that kind of post-national political organization. Jay Goolsby says it's because we're in a chronosynclastic infundibulum. No guarantee that I've said that right. Of course, Jay Goolsby, I did have to go and Google that immediately. That is the central sort of plot device from Kurt Vonnegut's novel Sirens of Titan. Last week's episode was named Sirens of Titan. This week's episode, of course, also had a literary reference point in that it was termed Brave New World. Chronosynclastic infundibulum, it turns out, is some sort of device that has a lot to do with alternate history, with different timelines or different points in time being able to be experienced simultaneously. Maybe there's a message there from the show's creators. I'm sure that they certainly read a lot of sci-fi alternate history works before they sat down to write For All Mankind. So thank you for that elliptical tip into what Sirens of Titan meant, the title of last week's episode. Finally, Chris Gannon writes, I've never interpreted For All Mankind as utopian, optimistic certainly, but realistic in its presentation of human beings earnestly wanting different things without real malice. I think that's an interesting point. I've often been the person on this channel who's talked about For All Mankind as a utopian work, and I think this does give an opportunity to make a point about utopian theorizing or utopian literature. I think you're definitely right in that the utopian idea has come to be associated with a perfect place free of political conflict and a sort of blueprint of a finalized, perfect human society. And that's certainly the common understanding of the term in our culture. And I agree that For All Mankind is not that. There is a maybe more specialized or more niche use of the term amongst those who work in politics and philosophy and cultural studies, who would call themselves utopian theorists, who think of the utopia as not a perfect society, but just a better society, and think of the point of utopian texts and utopian theories not as providing sort of authoritarian blueprints, but as providing just the impulse to be better, and as opening up space for understanding that things can not only be different, but can be better. And I think For All Mankind is utopian in that maybe narrower reading of the term. That's the purpose of the series, is to show that our history could have been different and therefore our future could be different, and that it's humans acting in agentic ways who could forge that difference. But thanks for that comment. It was really useful to be able to think about those different understandings of the term utopian. All right, that brings us to an end of our discussion of this episode. I hope there's been something of value in this video. If there has been, please like and subscribe. Please do leave a comment. We love to receive them. But on that bombshell,